On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Amit Gulati. He is the SVP of Engineering at Angi. We're going to talk about what it means to be an engineering leader, and more specifically, as you're moving through the engineering leadership ranks, what it means to kind of change those different roles and how does that impact you in your life. Amit, thanks for being on to talk about this.
Thank you for having me, Amir. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome, man. Let's start off at the top with two things. One, what does Angi do? And then secondly, what are some of your responsibilities as the SVP of engineering there?
So Angi is something most folks probably have heard of by now under the name Angie's List. We actually rebranded just over a year and a half ago, where we dropped the list because Angi is a lot more than just a list where people can find service professionals. So what we really do is we are a marketplace where we try to connect homeowners and home service providers to help the homeowners manage home improvements, home maintenance, and really help people turn their home into something that they love, a place that they love to be. As the SVP of engineering there, my focus is really on the product engineering teams. So we've got a team of about 300 folks who partner with product management to deliver the right value for the business, create those features and functionality, and operate those and respond to issues in production support. And I'm really looking to create an environment where my teams can thrive and really build the right things to create the right value for our customers.
All right. And I know you got some good stories to share, and we dive into the topic. And I know a lot of times we're talking about people moving into management as their first step into leadership, and that transition is a challenge. I don't know if a lot of times we talk about moving from a manager to director to VP, SVP type titles, and the changes that someone has to go through in their career. And I guess that's the topic we're going to tackle today. And I think as we're kind of looking at some of that, understanding what it means to be an engineering leader at each level is very important. I guess to start off with, maybe we can just kind of tackle from your perspective, your own experience as kind of you've gone through that progression in your career. Looking back, making that initial jump from manager to director, what were the shifts in terms of just your world? Like, obviously more responsibilities, of course, but what were some of the shifts that you're starting to see as you made that transition?
To me, the most significant way to measure, identify the difference in responsibilities as you progress through management tiers is focusing on your sphere of influence, right? And this starts really at an entry-level engineering position where your sphere of influence is on yourself and your growth and your execution and your day, right? You're looking at what am I doing today and am I getting my commitments done? Then as you become a more senior engineer, your influence goes broader to your team and the sprint that you're on. So you're not just looking at a very narrow thing, it's slightly broader. As an engineering manager, then you're not just looking at your team, you start looking at the teams around you. And typically an organization will have a vertical, right? So you have a set of teams working on one specific area. So you're starting to influence them, and it's more at a quarter level, right? Because you're starting to look a little longer term. Then you get up to director, and it becomes broader than just your vertical. It becomes your organization, right? Which again is going to be a set of verticals, and you're going to be looking a little bit longer term now, maybe out to the year. And then in these VP, SVP, and more executive level roles, then your sphere of influence is the company and the future. You're not even just focused on the present and what you're getting through, but really, hey, where are we going to be in year, 3 years, 5 years, and so on.
Absolutely. I guess as you're talking about the sphere of influence, obviously your day-to-day focus shifts, that sphere grows. You have a wider view of what you're doing, essentially. And I guess when you kind of look at that in, the shift in focus, that sphere of influence, as you're going through each layer of leadership, getting to that, the SVP, the EVP level, as you kind of go through that, I mean, the skill set has to change because obviously the world you're looking at changes. You're starting to look at the entire company. I mean, that seems like a big gap. So obviously the progression in leadership. But when you're starting off and you're in that smaller sphere of influence of your team and a smaller control, and you're looking to move up into that director role or director to EVP, SVP, whatever the next jump is at your company, those skills need to start, I guess, being developed. They're not something that, unless you're God-given skills, you're just going to jump up to that level and just, excel. But a lot of times we need to develop those skills. How do we develop those skills? There's no school you go to if you're being promoted to go, hey, go learn how to be a director from manager. We've got to get those skills to people, right?
Absolutely. I think one of the signs of a strong organization, at least the kind of organizations that I've thrived in and that I encourage people around me to try to look for, are ones where we do acknowledge that these are changes and these are new skill sets that aren't going to come naturally. And so you will have management training type of courses. You create opportunities for people to learn how to give feedback, how to hold effective one-on-ones, things that are going to help them do the new job a little bit better, right? And those are engineering management skills that do stay with you all the way up the tiers. But then the other piece of it is really, I think it comes from building your own network. I think that's where I've had the most success, is building a network of mentors and peers, people that I can talk to, and realizing that I need to learn from other people who have experienced things at these levels or at these higher levels. And so I found the most success that I had in learning how to do my job better as I got into these higher ranks came from talking with someone, a friend who's a sales executive at a finance company. The work that he does and the work that I do have nothing to do with each other, but at the same time, the leadership skills around how to think about the problems you're facing a little bit differently, how to focus them from an impact and an outcome perspective rather than the outputs that you're creating, are things that come really through conversations with folks who've done leadership or perform leadership roles, regardless of the type of industry or sector that they're in.
Absolutely. No, I agree with you 100%. People management transcends. I think one thing I love about this podcast is that whether I'm talking to engineering or security or data, the leadership concepts really do go pretty wide. You mentioned something about outputs. And I think, as you're talking about sphere of influence, how far you get away from the direct output of whatever you're in charge of starts separating. You get that wider distance, the less control you have, your focus, that prioritization changes, because obviously now you're being pulled in different directions, other leaders. I could easily see somebody moving from these different levels will have to also adjust in terms of making sure they have enough time for themselves, not to be pulled into other stuff that they shouldn't be. That's again another skill you got to get good at, because at the management level, it's one thing. At the manager level, director level, VP level, that's got to be something you've got to, I guess, kind of grow into as well.
Absolutely. I get asked the question of what are those key skills or key habits that I developed that help me kind of progress through my career as I have. And the two that always stand out to me most impactfully are learning how to say no more and learning how to ask for help more. It seems somewhat counterintuitive to a lot of people, right? Because when you're early in your career, you actually think, you're taught that you need to figure things out for yourself. You need to take on more responsibility. You need to go claim, go take. And as you get more senior in your role, what you find is more and more people are asking you to do that. More and more people are trying to take your time. And the way that you succeed here is by knowing when to say no and knowing when to put up the walls and take that control back, right? I found that the more times I asked people for help, the more I was willing to say, hey, I'm not sure how to do this. I need somebody to help teach me how to do this. The more people respected my professional maturity and the more opportunities they gave me, because they knew that if I found something or came across something that I wasn't going to be able to be successful at, that I wouldn't hide it. I wouldn't feel like I had to keep that a secret, and that we would solve the problem together, because in the end, we all do just want to solve the problems and create the right value. So really, those are the things I think that you kind of have to flip your mindset around as you go into leadership and then trying to continue work your way up that chain.
that's a tricky one. I mean, you have that inherent ability. You feel that comfort of asking for help. I think a lot of times people don't. I think, the concept of imposter syndrome is something that, we think maybe happens in earlier career people who are taking on new roles, want to say yes and take on more. And before they know it, they're drowning. I guess in what you just described, you could easily see somebody who's moved into a new level of management isn't 100% sure how to operate, keep saying yes to other people, wants to, get that approval, take on more, take those responsibilities and shoulder them. Before you know it, they're in the deep end. All of a sudden, instead of, delivering and being successful, they're being asked, why are, things slipping? Why are things not, working out? And I mean, that's a whole slippery slope in of itself.
Oh, absolutely. I appreciate that you said I just had this ability innately. It is by no means that. I learned this over time, frankly, through failure. The best way to learn is to fail. I've had plenty of roles, especially in my early management days, where I was like, of course I can do that. Of course I can do that. Of course I can do that. The next thing I know, I've been working 80 to 100-hour weeks for weeks, months at a time. And I had friends practically have an intervention and say, listen, you're no longer healthy. We can see it in you, right? So this isn't something that comes easy or comes naturally. I imagine to almost anyone. If you don't feel like you're an imposter at some points, and I think you're not trying to push yourself a little bit, right? I try to remind myself every time I have those doubts of saying, wait, why am I here? Am I the right person to be doing this? I kind of remind myself that's exactly why I am the right person to be doing this, because I have those doubts. If I thought I knew all the answers, then that would mean that I'm clearly not ready to be in a role where you can't possibly have all the answers.
And I appreciate your comment. I think that's great to know. And something you just said made me think about this concept of imposter syndrome. And I know it's real, right? It's not something imaginary. I've gone through it. You've gone through it. Like you mentioned. I think everyone who's trying to push themselves puts themselves in those positions of fringe areas you're comfortable with. And I think what happens is, I wonder if this is an organizational cultural issue. I know we call it imposter syndrome. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a executive at any company, but just on the outside, sometimes when I look at this concept, I talk to the leaders, I'm looking at that going, I wonder if people are not comfortable raising their hands and saying, I don't know how to do this, because that's not viewed as a positive attribute in an organization. It might be viewed as a negative. People, put down and go, well, he doesn't know how to do this. And all of a sudden, you're put in a position of going, I'd rather be quiet than raise my hand and ask for help.
I think that's a really fair point, Amir. There are a lot of organizations that kind of breed that almost toxic leadership style. And that creates an environment that really is hard for anybody to thrive in, right? For me personally, I don't know that I've always worked in organizations that have been entirely open to accepting failure and accepting asks for help. But I've maybe been fortunate that I've had managers and leaders and peers around me that have reinforced that for me. One of the most common things I find myself saying to people nowadays is, especially in these difficult economic times, people's jobs are changing, people have uncertainty. One of the things I often remind folks of is you go to work for a company because of what it does or what its product is or what you've heard about it, but you stay at a company because of the people that you work with, the people who are really helping you become the next version of who you're trying to be and help you along that path for yourself. So what I really kind of try to do is, I can't necessarily say that I'm going to make the entire culture of an entire organization of thousands of people be a certain way. But what I can do, this goes back to that sphere of influence. What I can do is I can teach my direct reports that the more they ask ask me for help, the more I will reward them. The same way my manager has instilled that and reinforced that in me, and try and set that example and that tone so it trickles down, and so that it creates that environment where people will feel more empowered and will feel more open about asking for help and being willing to say no and push back on things.
I agree. That's interesting. I actually was talking to my daughter last night. She's 9, and I was telling her about when I was younger and I was 9, I made a mistake and how my parents would react. And she was like, "What do you mean they reacted that way?" I go, "Well, that's just the way, I'm 48. So I'm like, that's the way they reacted when you made a mistake. It wasn't quite as accepting." And she kind of held my hand. She said, "Well, I feel bad for you, Daddy." And I was like, "Well, hon, we learn. And that's why I as a parent now want to make sure when you make a mistake, you realize we just want to figure out what we could do better the next time." And it's not a case of, you made a mistake and I'm upset. And it's interesting what you said is, if your manager promotes that culture, that way of thinking, I don't like the idea of blameless, because it's almost blameless is a very difficult concept. It's very, overwhelming to say it's blameless, but we need to understand what the mistake was, where did it stem from? What were the issues? And, like you've been saying, I think, you mentioned controlling the two aspects of being able to say no and knowing what you're taking on and when to ask for help. I think it's that little balance of having that right dynamic of being, okay, I can raise my hand. I'm okay. I feel safe. And they're going to teach me. I'm going to do this with a little bit of hand holding until I go off. And hopefully, as I progress, I'll take that with me on the next toolkit that I've added to.
Absolutely. I think from an engineering perspective in particular, we actually do start to learn that when we're still in that individual contributor engineering state. I've found that I oftentimes equate the challenges of leadership and management to how I solve actual programming problems. But this one in particular is when you think about avoiding that spiral down, avoiding that spinning on a problem that we do as engineers. I think anybody who's written code professionally for more than a year or two has had one of those experiences where you're trying to solve something and you're like, okay, I spent an hour, I spent 4 hours, I spent 2 days, wait a minute. I spent 2 days trying to solve something and I still feel like I haven't made any progress. Now it's okay for me to go ask for help. If I asked after 4 hours, then I would have been being lazy and pawning off the problem. But if I start to realize that there's a time when I'm not going to solve this by myself, right? And that's kind of one of those tactical analogies to me where I can say, hey, the way I solve problems as an engineer is not dissimilar from the way I solve problems as a manager or as a leader.
Absolutely. I like that. That's actually a good analogy. I think, engineers, they have those smaller spheres of influence to solve these smaller problems, going back to the concept of that sphere of influence. And you get some of those, skill sets of being able to ask for help early, because in engineering, it's a little bit different. It's not that every time you're creating something new, it's a problem you might have never seen. And it could come up next day, next week, next month. And it seems like it's a constant part of, the profession. So that's an interesting, view that that's a skill you can learn early. I guess on the flip side of that, you mentioned obviously, saying no and actually, trying to control your calendar, trying to not take on more than you can. I guess when you're looking at that side of it, right? So not asking for help is one danger. And I think you mentioned that's one of the two keys. And then being able to say no is the other. And again, maybe it goes a little bit hand in hand to understand, how much capacity you have, how much you can take on. When you're looking at that, saying no, what have you kind of learned through your progression in terms of being comfortable? Like what did it take for you to start being comfortable to say no?
For me, I think I started to learn how to say no when I had one of those great managers who saw me say yes and said, wait, are you sure? Are you sure you have time for that? I'm like, yeah, you need this. So of course I'm going to do it for you. Yeah, but I'm not asking you to work an extra 5 or 10 or 20 hours. So are you sure you can do this? It's okay to tell me that something has to slip or ask me, is this more important than that thing? And that's really where it came from for me. You have to have people around you who are going to encourage these same habits in you. I don't think anybody can grow. Well, I suppose it's a little arrogant for me to say nobody, but I've never met anybody who can grow into a senior, who was able to grow into a senior leadership role without a lot of support from a lot of people around them. Right? It's like at the Oscars or the Emmys, where everyone goes up on stage and says thank you to everybody that they've ever come across in their lives. That's really also true. It has to be true to get to a more senior level where you're starting to have an impact and an influence on such a broad set of people. You just can't get there alone.
So I guess the one thing that I was just thinking about was, we're talking about saying no. You mentioned how a manager observed and noticed you needed some help and questioned you. And obviously he's taking on what you're telling him. He has to make a decision. Hey, can Amit do this? Can he not? He's got to trust you. You got to trust your team. And he had to give you enough room to operate, maybe fail, maybe succeed. And as a leader, as you move into the VP levels, is that a bigger part of your job to go, I got to give my team the latitude as a manager. I need to learn to let go, let them operate. I'm there, I'm watching. If they need help, hopefully they're coming. If not, I'm still kind of seeing how the plays are unfolding to step in if needed.
Yes, absolutely. As I've expanded my role and started to be more and more distance from the execution of things and the work that's actually getting done, the way I kind of approach it is, and I think this is something that I didn't coin, I'm not sure, but I think of it as a team API. What I look to my direct reports, who at this time they're vice presidents, I ask them, like, listen, this is what I need to be able to know. I need to be able to see that we're doing the right things. I need to be able to see that the work we're doing is creating the right value. And I need to be able to see that we're not making bad decisions from an architectural perspective that are going to lead to slowed down development and more difficulty innovating down the road. That's what I need to know. You can get that information to me however you want, right? I'm giving you this interface and I need you to give me the result that I'm asking for and give them to me roughly in this format, because that's how I can ingest them best and that's how I can roll them up together. And the rest is up to you, right? And that's really the first step of latitude, is you stop being focused on how and you just say, hey, this is the what that I need, and you get to decide the how. And so that's one place where I feel like you start to give more and more latitude to folks. And the other piece to that is I do find myself in situations where I hear somebody working through a problem and I see the path that they're going to take, and I'm like, that's not going to work. I have enough experience and I've seen similar types of situations, so I'm fairly certain that's not going to work. But I'm never going to tell somebody, do it because I said so. That's the wrong way to get people to do things. So I'll gauge in that moment, well, if they do it their way, this is probably what's going to happen. Is that okay? Yeah, we can recover from that. So I'm going to let that happen, and I'm going to let them learn that lesson for themselves, because that's going to be way more impactful, way more powerful than me giving any kind of direction or trying to force it down on them.
I like that. I think that's a really a cool way of looking at that in terms of how big will the impact be? Can you recover from it? And kind of understanding that person has to kind of play it out, because sounds like that's kind of how you saw their managers. And I think the one thing I've noticed is that when you have really strong engineering leaders that you're learning from, these habits seem to come easier to some people, which obviously we talked about. It's they're not inherent in most people. We got to learn them. We got to trial and error failing, and hopefully as we grow and develop these better cultures for failing and learning, more people will kind of be able to be comfortable within these constructs and hopefully have these transitions be slightly better.
I think about this a lot with how I want to empower my teams to deliver too, right? They often say something like, oh, hey, we need to be careful about how we release this because we don't know, we don't want to risk breaking anything. And I always say, don't be careful, because that's operating from a perspective of fear and uncertainty. just be confident that you're going to be the first one to know that something went wrong. And this is how I teach, like, building good software, right? Having the right observability metrics and the right dashboards and alerting in place. But it's true in how we grow our people and how we help teach them how to make decisions too. It's not about being careful. It's about creating an environment and reinforcing the fact that it's okay to make mistakes. Just keep making new ones and make sure you're the one that figures out it's a mistake and you're the one who's kind of driving the effort to fix it or address the repercussions.
Awesome, man. I think that's actually, I love how you put that, and I think that's a great. I was paying attention to the time. I'm like, oh, he's probably got to get back to his day job and manage. But I wanted to thank you for being on the show. Thank you for sharing. I greatly appreciate it.
Absolutely, Amir. It was a lot of fun to be here. Thanks a lot for having me. I'm looking forward to see how this turns out.
All right, definitely. So 2 final questions for you before I let you go. One is, I ask everybody, if there's a topic you want a future guest to address, what that would be.
I would love to hear more about partnership between engineering and product. That's something that comes up a lot in my world these days, and hearing more perspective on what that partnership looks like and what's the right dynamic and interaction model between and ownership model between product and engineering leadership.
Awesome. That's actually a good one. I actually, for some reason, be honest with you, I don't know why I haven't covered that aspect yet, but hopefully soon. And then if somebody wants to reach out to you, I mean, you got some great, awesome content here. People might want to reach out, touch base with you, pick your brain. What's a good way of getting a hold of you, Amit?
Yeah, absolutely. LinkedIn is really the best way to get in touch with me. I assume my profile information will be in the notes, but DM me. I look at that fairly frequently, and I'd love to meet folks. I'd love to continue to build that network and find new folks to learn from. And I love to teach too. So if I can be of any help to anybody, please, happy to chat more.
Awesome, man. We'll include that in the show notes when we publish the episode. And I guess that's it for this episode. We'll be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, 2 things. One, if you can talk about the relationship between product and engineering, reach out to me. I'd love to have you on, or if you know someone that could, let me know. Secondly, if you found the podcast useful, please share it with somebody else, or put a review wherever you listen to it. That's how the podcast is organically grown. And I thank everyone who does that. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.